So let's summarize where we are in our look at fielding analytics and range factor as a metric. Using box score data that's been collected for over a century and represented in the layman database in the SQL Sandbox, we can look at different range fielding metrics, and hopefully by now we've made the case that today's game requires range metrics as opposed to the old look at sure-handedness metrics, in other words, looking at errors. So we looked at range factor per game and range factor adjusted for 9 innings. And in the previous video, we talked about the problem with these metrics. And we listed a lot of different criticisms of these metrics and how they don't really get at range. And in response to that, researchers came up with improved range factors. So you had the adjusted range factor created by Tom Tippett and the relative range factor talked about by Bill James in the Fielding Bible book. The development of these metrics was a response to all the criticisms of the simpler range factor metrics, but they all were limited by using this box score level data. You want to get a measure of range factor, and you want to adjust it the correct way, depending on position, depending on the field, depending on the pitching staff, batting, handedness, and you wanted to end up getting it to the currency of the game into runs itself. So you wanted to convert the metrics themselves into a run value. So you could have a real run value of a fielder. Now, we've talked before about runs being the currency of the game, and there's no difference here. In the early 80s, there was a move by Pete Palmer and John Thorne to create fielding runs, an attempt at measuring all the components of fielding for all the different fielders and convert it into runs. We've talked about hitting linear weights. What Pete Palmer and John Thorne called this was defensive linear weights. Defensive linear weights. Thorne and Palmer were trying to measure fielding runs and ultimately get to fielding wins. They wanted to create an all-encompassing statistic, one that incorporated the run value of batting, the run value of pitching, base running, and fielding. So this was put together in something they called total player wins. So I wanted to show you this quote by Branch Rickey, and he wrote this in 1954. "There is nothing on earth anybody can do with fielding." Now, the context of this quote is he was writing in this article about the measurement of offense, hitting performance, and pitching, and how he enjoyed thinking about those metrics. But he threw his hands up when he considered fielding. He understood the place of fielding in the game and winning and losing, but just recognizing the frustration of trying to use fielding percentage or error rates as some kind of measure of fielding. The whole point of sharing Branch Rickey's quote here is to emphasize again the revolution that Thorne and Palmer actually started with their work on fielding runs. This effort to try to get total player wins required them to get at fielding wins and fielding runs. And they went through the hard effort of doing their best to estimate fielding runs and fielding wins with box score level data. And this started the revolution that led to many other advancements in fielding, even with box score data. They looked at each position on the field, and they decided the value of each of these measurements in trying to measure the fielding value of each position. So one example of this was putouts was de-emphasized for catchers and first basemen. Errors are different on the infield and the outfield. Each position had their own formula and their own analysis. And they weighted these box score level data to get league averages. And this is important. That's the start, is to get the league average of runs at each position. And what they did then was take that league average runs at each position and convert them to team runs for each position. So they looked at the team level box score data and used it as a way to say, how is the team relative to the league average? So if the league average is here, each team would get team runs relative to the league average runs, the mean here. So after they got the team level runs, they would give each player runs based on putout percentage. The putout percentage is something they can measure in the box score level data. The Layman database has putouts for each fielder at each position. If putouts were split between two players in any given season, team runs would be split on the percentage of putouts. So it was a 50-50 split between two fielders at one position. The team runs at that position would be split and divided between those two fielders. So this simple procedure, this little algorithm of looking at league average for box score level data that was converted to runs for each position on the field. Do that for teams, and do for each team now you convert it to runs based on league average. So you get above and below league average, and league average would be 0 runs. Then you get teams which had better defense at a position. They would get positive runs. And then the teams below the mean would get negative runs. So those team runs then would be apportioned based on putout percentage. So the reemergence of fielding analytics out of the dark ages of errors and fielding percentage really starts with Pete Palmer and John Thorne.